This is radio in World War II. Um, so this is the home and introduction page right here. This is what you get open to on the website. Right up here we have our thesis. The use of the radio in World War II relates to communication history because the radio helped Allies communicate to the German citizens over long distances. The radio also allowed them to communicate to military forces to plan the best strategy, and the radio also allowed them to keep up to date on what was happening in other regions. So let's jump right into it. So a little bit of back information of the radio is that we're not fully sure on who was the first inventor of the radio, but the first demonstration was by Nikola Tesla in 1893, but the person who got the patents was somebody in England in 1896. The first successful trans, uh, why can't I think of this? The first transatlantic signals was in 1901, and that was one of the first really successful tests of the radio. Here's a picture of a late 1800s, early 1900s radio operator. Um, Here's a really neat picture that I found of a family in the living room sitting around the radio, and this is what it would look like about every evening in a normal household. And here's a little bit into the mid 1900s radio operator. Now, everybody knows World War II or the Second World War. It was a global war from 1939 to 1945. It all started when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. The US didn't get involved until about 1941, and that's when the war really started to take a turn. There were several countries that were involved: Japan, Russia, Poland, Germany, um, Europe, including England. Yeah, there was a lot of people involved in the World War II. Types of radios. There were plentiful radios used in World War II, but some of the most popular were SCR 300 radios, SCR 536 radios, and BC 654 radios. The SCR 300 radio was one of the more popular. It was nicknamed the walkie-talkie because a single troop could wear it on his back. It weighed about 35 pounds with about a range of 3 miles. Then we had the SCR 536, which was a handy talkie. It weighed about 5 pounds, most of it being batteries. It was invented in 1940, but was started to get widely used in 1941. It had about a mile of range over land and 3 miles over water. BC 654 was a much larger radio. It weighed about 50 pounds, took about 3 people to run it, one person spinning a bicycle-style power unit, another person operating the radio, and a third person making sure everything was working. This one had about a 5 to 20 mile range, depending on landscape. This was great because it could be mounted in tanks, aircraft, boats, military transport vehicles like Jeeps or 5 tons. Now on to entertainment in the 40s. Now I'm sure most of us listen to a top 40 playlist. And the number one of the decade was In the Mood by Glenn Miller, worldwide actually. It was targeted towards like families, preteens. It was anybody who would really listen to it. They would play music, different entertainment shows, comedies, news, anything that we have, they had pretty much. Now, radio in the US, they had the most advanced radio system, and they had nearly 389,000 listeners just on New York radio station. According to a 1947 C.E. Hooper survey, 82 out of 100 Americans were found to be radio listeners, which is pretty cool. Here's a picture of Radio City. Um, a lot of shows were broadcasted out of here. This is in New York City. And this is where WHTZ FM was broadcasted out of. Now, radio in Germany was a different story. They actually manufactured really cheap radios that all the citizens could own and listen to German propaganda like 24/7. And if you couldn't own a radio, they had loudspeakers hooked up in public areas, so you couldn't escape it. Um, yeah. Now on to the propaganda. Now, radio took the propaganda from the radio was pretty great. Propaganda is when you have biased or misleading information. And this is the radio I was talking about in the previous page. I could try to pronounce it, the Volkswagen. I demolished that, but it was designed by Otto Griesing um, at the request of Joseph Goebbels, which was one of the leaders of the Nazi regime, and he kind of maintained the propaganda part of it. But yeah, these were extremely affordable, but there was no like music stations. It was all propaganda and speeches, which is pretty crazy. Now, China, they also had, and Japan, they also had mini radio stations that you could listen to as well. This is just a poster from Japan about World War II. I wish I knew what that would say, but Japan had a ton of propaganda misleading their people and making them think that they were the number one, they were the best, they were top, and they had great ideas. They had radio, newspapers, posters, and they even had laws in place. Here's a example of U.S. propaganda. Everybody's seen this picture. You can see this poster in like every world geo teacher's room. During active American involvement, propaganda was used quite heavily in the U.S. to make people buy war bonds for materials for the war so that they could have more and more money for creating sweet things, I guess. But yeah, they had plenty of radio stations that would keep their Americans up to date on what was going on in the war. Now, radio in the war. This was one of the first times where we had true wartime journalists. Here's a picture of wartime journalists. They weren't allowed to be armed, but they had a full military style uniform. They would go around asking people what they were experiencing or what was going on in the war, if they were going to advance, but not a lot of people who were fighting the war liked that very much, so they didn't get respected very well. Now, news, there were plenty of news that was in World War II. Because of the wartime journalists, they could update people in different countries, like the Americans had wartime journalists, and they would report back to America for radio stations or newspapers. Here's a New York Times newspaper article. Okay, so yep, there's the article. Sorry, it cut me off there. Now we can go to the sources page. And once you're on the sources page, it takes you to first the primary sources. Here's all the primary sources. Scroll down, then you go to secondary sources, and here are my secondary sources. You go back home. So that's radio in World War II.